Hey, Scott Jordan here, and this is your Thursday, July 30th COVID update. And yes, we're following best practices with masks, even though we don't actually need them. Hey, Mark Warner, how's it going? What's hot out there in the news?
There's a lot going on in the news these days, Scott. Obviously, with the spikes occurring in different parts of the country, everybody's wondering what does that mean about getting back to work. So most of the news is revolving around best practices for getting back to work. One of the hotter things that came out in the last week or so was the guidelines coming out of Green Seal that references the CDC and EPA guidelines for back to work. So that kind of sets the stage for the things that we want to chat about today.
Yeah, we are going to take this week off, or at least do our best of video, but we decided because everybody's talking about going back to work, we should do one more show this week, and then next week it's the best of COVID video update. While Mark is on vacation is somewhere not COVID related.
There you go. That's true.
Yeah.
And it'll be the best of, so you can just imagine what those short clips will be referencing.
Yeah, maybe
all the way back to day one.
You never know. He might be. He might be featured. You never know. They call that a teaser in the video business.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, Mark, let's get into it. We got to keep this to 7 minutes. Not 10, not 15.
You do know me, right? But anyway, the tips that we wanted to make sure that we're providing ties into everything that we're doing, trying to help society. And whether that is providing disinfectants or whether it's providing good guidance, good information, and good tips, that's always been the mantra for the Bullen companies. That everything revolves around good education. So part of the idea behind the COVID-19 update program in 2020 is the 2020 COVID-19 update is to be able to provide some tips, and one of them is really simple, but it's amazing to me how many people tend to overlook it, and that is to encourage everybody to be wearing their PPEs. It's amazing to me that there can be so many deaths related to this particular pandemic, and yet there's still people out there that are either resistant to wearing masks, or when they do wear masks, they're being somewhat lazy about wearing it properly.
You mean the Karens of the world?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, technically, a mask needs to cover the nose and the mouth. Otherwise, what's the point? So that's kind of what we want to make sure we're encouraging. Also making sure that if they're involved in any other aspect of the cleaning industry, that they're wearing the proper PPEs for that task, which may include, certainly includes disposable gloves, in some cases double gloving, and in other cases eye protection. So, we need to make sure that everybody is encouraged to wear their PPEs.
Yep, good. And maybe future shows you can teach everybody the proper technique for removing gloves. Because I know that's something that people do wrong, despite wearing the gloves, and they take them off the wrong way, and they've kind of negated the whole purpose of the glove. But we'll get into that. We'll get into that at future shows.
I always love seeing, Scott, where somebody's wearing gloves and they'll scratch their nose, and it's like, what are you doing?
Yeah. Okay, so another tip is need for barriers. A good example is in the Bullen office, as many offices had that kind of open floor plan where you didn't have cubicles anymore. I mean, people that can afford that are opening their businesses back up are tearing out all that stuff and building cubicles with walls and stuff. So in our case, we have our order entry department previously faced each other so they could easily communicate with each other about orders that are coming in because they share a communal email address. So we put up plexiglass barriers between those two people. So even though they only have, the physical barrier is maybe chest high, they have a plexiglass barrier. And then Ashley, in our case in the order department, has utilized the plexiglass barrier as a place to put Post-it notes. So I said eventually she's going to have a wall of Post-it notes, so she's not even going to be able to see the other person, Juanita, on the other side. But creative use of a physical barrier. So if you don't have the ability to completely revamp your office layout, these are hung from the ceiling. So if you have a hanging ceiling, it's pretty easy to run a chain down with a piece of plexiglass. Those people are making money. Plexiglass people, they're doing as well as us with disinfectants. But so that's a fast tip. So you don't have to tear out your offices. Just create barriers with plexiglass. Next.
And the key rule to the barriers is all about that social distancing. So you don't need a barrier if people are 20 feet apart, but certainly most offices are built to be somewhat efficient. And so barriers allow us to keep that compact control center without trying to spread people apart too far.
Yep. The next tip is something that's kind of obvious and not quite as easy as some of the others, is making sure you have an adequate supply of all the materials that you're going to need to create a safe, pathogen-free environment. That would include things like the face masks, proper disinfectants, hand soap, all the things that you would need to perform what everybody's telling us to do. But it's not quite that easy to maybe source some of those supplies. But if you start thinking ahead, like we're stockpiling some raw materials, potentially if things really blow up in the fall, we'll have enough material to supply an increased need for disinfectants. Same should be true on your end if you're an office or a manufacturing company or whatever your business is. Make sure you have sufficient supplies. Don't go crazy and buy a 10-year supply of toilet paper or something like that, but try to have an adequate supply because you never know what's going to happen.
Well, tied into that is point number 4, and that is if you're going to create a inventory, a backup inventory or preparatory inventory of disinfectants, you need to make sure that you're following proper procedures, proper protocol.
Yep.
And number 1 on that is to have the proper disinfectant. There's hundreds of thousands of disinfectants out there in the world, but the only ones that are particularly relevant when we have a COVID-19 pandemic going on is something that appears on the EPA N list as being what's called efficacious for COVID-19, meaning that it's effective in inactivating the SARS-CoV-2 virus that causes COVID-19 disease. So that's like number 1 thing on processes. Second thing is making sure that you know what to focus on. What are the hot spots? Do I have to clean the ceiling 10 times a day? Probably not. Not a lot of people walking up there.
Nope.
The reality of it is, where are your hot spots? And in general, the hot spots are obviously touch points, but they're not the only hot spots. Above the floor horizontal surfaces like receptionist desks, desktops themselves, counters where the copier machine is, even in a break room where the coffee machine is. All of those things can be a hot spot as well, because there's so many people that are coming in contact with those areas, and yet they're not commonly thought of as touch points, the same way we would think of a doorknob or a handrail being a touch point.
I've heard the Keurig machines are particularly hot. Not only hot for the temperature, but people don't even think about that. That one section you push down that is very limited, that apparently is something you really have to focus on, because everybody that gets a cup of coffee touches that in the same place.
Yeah, and some of the other things that people never think about, Scott, is the most contaminated thing any of us have on our body at any given time.
Yep. Oh, you just dip it
right there.
Don't you just dip it in the disinfectant?
You just throw it in a bucket of bleach, wait 10 minutes. But, obviously the easy way to do it is to use hand sanitizer on a cloth, use it on your hands, wipe it off.
Yeah.
Why not? It's alcohol. It's got a low water content, and it certainly sanitizes it in the same way that it does your hands. And your hands are immediately in contact with it anyway. Third area that we look for is how is things potentially trafficking around our buildings. So don't ignore floor areas. traffic lanes on hard floors or traffic lanes in carpeted areas are also considered hotspots because anything expectorated into the air, you like that?
No, expectorate.
A cough, a hack, a sneeze, it will eventually precipitate down to either desktops or to the floor, and it can track. And things actually track around in buildings, and people come in contact with objects that have been in contact with the floor. That's called a fomite. So although we don't crawl around on the floor ourselves as adults, we do tie our shoelaces, we pick up our cords, we drop our pens. All these things are interactive with the floor. So the floor is an area we have to focus on. And then the other thing is making sure we're doing the right frequencies. Now, a question that we get an awful lot, Scott, about frequencies is, what is the right frequency? Well, it varies. It depends on the amount of traffic, right? So a church that is open every Sunday would have a radically different frequency than a department store that's open 24/7, being attacked by patrons on a second by second basis. So the whole traffic pattern is going to be a real important end of it. You mentioned the Keurig, so anything that might have high usage, whether it's copier machines, coffee machines, or whatever, those are also going to require a higher frequency than other areas, even though the number of people may not be changing. Yeah. And then we get into, of course, the degree of threat. Do you have an outbreak in your community? Is it spiking? If so, you ramp your game up. Is it on the decline or almost non-existence? Then we don't back off completely, but we can slow down the amount of frequency. So the degree of it, what we would call an environmental threat, is also part of that factor. Yeah. And that kind of takes us into point 5, Scott, which we get asked about a lot. And that is, if we're doing all that, what do we need to do beyond that? And one of the big buzzwords that's been coming up a lot, especially in the standards technical advisory committees that we're involved with, is communication. And there's 2 levels of that. The communication that you might do when your employees are coming back in might include signage. It might include ideas of what areas are safe, what areas haven't been cleaned yet. It might also be a sign to remind people to take extra care about their workspace area, their own workspace. Take responsibility for sanitizing it and cleaning it. And there's other communication levels too if something happens, right, Scott? Yeah,
there's a whole plan that CDC requires, particularly for businesses that have had an outbreak. Before they can reopen, they need to have a whole SOP set up for what they're going to do to go back into business. And that's super, super critical, because you can not only can people get sick again very quickly if you don't follow the procedures, there's also some serious legal situations that you might get yourself into if you don't follow things. And that involves things like temperature checks, increase in the disinfection that we just talked about, and all of the above, all these other tips that we've discussed. So you have SOPs, standard operating procedures, for what you do just for general business operations when you don't have an outbreak, and then there's a whole separate set of steps, and we'll have a link below this video for that information from CDC as to what you have to do if, in fact, you do have an outbreak in your facility, and how you can get back in business. Doesn't mean you're shut down for forever, but you do have to follow some very specific steps to be able to safely open your business back up again.
You and I were talking earlier about the different steps that an employer needs to take if there is a documented exposure to COVID-19 in a building, and what an employer really needs to do. And what I picked up on was your comment about phasing.
Yep.
And that's kind of a way of figuring out how you phase people into it. Who do you bring back at what frequency, and so on. I thought that was fascinating.
Yep. So all good stuff. So that's 6 quick tips on how you can maintain your business currently, and what you have to do if something happens. Hope that's been helpful. Again, there'll be a link below the video from the CDC that gives you some more details on it from their perspective. Other than that, I think we covered it pretty well, Mark.
Well, I do too, and I'm actually really excited to see the best of the 2020 COVID-19 update series, which will be coming out next Wednesday.
Stay tuned.
Okay,
thanks
everybody.
Very much for tuning in, everybody. Stay safe out there. You too, Mark, on your vacation. Don't do anything crazy.
Will do.
Thank you.